In the centuries before the beginning of the Viking Age, the region we now know as Scandinavia was isolated by cold seas, lands covered in dense forests, and a harsh climate that shaped the life of small human communities. There were no unified kingdoms or cities, only scattered villages along the coast and in fertile valleys, where families and clans survived thanks to hunting, fishing, and a limited cultivation of grains that the poor soil and cold weather allowed. These Nordic groups were descendants of ancient Germanic tribes that over centuries had migrated to the far north of Europe, creating their own way of life marked by isolation and by the need to adapt to the most severe conditions of nature. This landscape of long winters and short summers taught men and women hardness, endurance, and courage, qualities that would become the foundation of the Viking identity that would later conquer the world. Historical records from this early period are scarce, as the Nordic peoples did not yet have a consolidated writing system and preserved their memory through oral tradition. Historians and archaeologists must rely on remnants of tools, rudimentary weapons, tombs, and ruins of small villages to reconstruct how these people lived before the year 700 after Christ. It is in this context that the first legends appear, transmitted from generation to generation around the fires during endless winters, stories that explain the origin of the world, the fury of storms, and the destiny of souls. Nordic culture fed on the mystery and power of nature, forging from an early age a people who would see the seas not as a barrier, but as a path. Scandinavia at that time was formed by regions that would later give rise to three great kingdoms: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Each of these areas was inhabited by clans led by tribal chiefs, the Jarls, who guaranteed protection and justice within their communities. These chiefs did not hold absolute power. Their prestige was earned by courage in battle, skill in negotiating alliances, and the ability to guide their people in times of scarcity and conflict. Around them lived free men who farmed the land and fished, while the enslaved, called thralls, performed the heaviest labor. This social division was already showing signs of the type of organization that would mark the following centuries. While these communities grew slowly, the rest of Europe was undergoing profound transformations. The Carolingian Empire was strengthening in the region of present-day France and Germany. The Christian Church was consolidating its power, and maritime trade was gaining importance along the coasts of the North Sea. This movement awakened in the Scandinavian peoples a growing desire to explore the world beyond the fjords and forests, especially because Scandinavia had limited resources and arable land was not sufficient for a population that was beginning to grow. This need for expansion would become one of the seeds of the Viking phenomenon. Another central element of this period before the Viking Age was their relationship with the sea. Even without yet possessing the famous Drakar ships that would later become symbols of their supremacy, the Nordic peoples were already experimenting with shipbuilding techniques adapted to rivers and fjords. Small and sturdy wooden boats served both for transport and for fishing, bringing these communities closer to a maritime culture that would become the heart of their identity. Each village depended on the sea to survive, learning to read the winds, the currents, and the tides as if they were natural extensions of their own territory. In the cultural and spiritual field, the foundation of these people's lives lay in mythology. They believed that the gods lived in Asgard, connected to the world of men by the rainbow bridge called Bifrost. Odin, Thor, Freya, and Loki were already feared and revered names even before the beginning of the great Viking expeditions. Worship of the gods did not take place in grand temples, but in sacred places of nature, such as clearings, hills, or groves where offerings and sacrifices were made. This strong religiosity shaped the way they understood life and death, creating a culture that saw existence as a cycle of constant challenges and conquests. Little by little, these small communities became more organized, connecting through marriages between clans, rudimentary trade exchanges, and defense pacts. Thus appeared the first signs of Nordic social networks, still fragile, but beginning to unite families and distant villages under common interests. This initial union, however, did not prevent internal disputes. Conflicts over land, honor, and resources were frequent, training these men for war from youth. These tribal wars were the school where northern warriors developed the ferocity and skill with weapons that would later be taken to other lands. This pre-Viking period, although little known, is essential to understand the emergence of the great Nordic conquerors. Every trait of this culture, The strength forged by the climate, the devotion to the gods, the organization into clans, the intimate relationship with the sea, and the need to expand territories, served as the foundation for the moment that would forever change the history of Europe. The first recorded Viking raid at the end of the 8th century, when the triangular sails of Nordic ships appeared on the horizon, marking the beginning of an era the world would never forget. To understand the birth of the Viking people, it is necessary to go far back in time, long before the beginning of their invasions, returning to a period when Scandinavia was nothing more than a wild territory inhabited by northern Germanic tribes whose roots are interwoven with ancestral myths and legends. The origin of these peoples was shaped by migrations that took place between the first millennium before Christ and the first centuries after Christ, when different human groups spread across the frozen lands of the Scandinavian peninsula. These populations were not initially called Vikings, but rather Northerners or Northern Germanics, and they carried with them a rustic way of life, marked by nomadism, simple agriculture, and herding. This long geographical isolation created an independent culture, in which customs and beliefs were passed down orally, forming a social fabric that united family, clan, and territory as inseparable elements. In the imagination of these peoples, the very explanation of life was rooted in foundational myths. Even before they mastered advanced navigation techniques or organized themselves as warriors, they believed that the universe had been born from chaos, from a primordial void called Ginnungagap. From this void emerged Niflheim, the world of ice, and Muspelheim, the world of fire. When heat and ice met, they created the giant Ymir, and from his body the world was born. This cosmogony was transmitted for centuries, forming the basis of Nordic thought, where the struggle between opposing forces explained not only creation, but the very essence of life, a constant battle that never ended. From this vision arose the idea that a man's destiny was to fight bravely even in the face of inevitable death, something that would later be reflected in the behavior of Vikings in battle. Over time, these Germanic tribes organized themselves into small family groups living in defined territories, known as clans. Each clan was self-sufficient and governed by a chief or jarl, whose authority was based on wisdom and strength. Around him gathered warriors and advisors who defended the community and made decisions for it. There was not yet a single kingdom, but rather a mosaic of small groups living scattered across the regions that would eventually become Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. This model of organization was extremely decentralized and granted freedom to each family, but it also created constant rivalries, with frequent battles over territory and resources. This practice of internal warfare would become the training ground that forged generations of hardened warriors. Another fundamental factor in the formation of these peoples was indirect contact with other cultures of Europe and Asia, through trade. Even in isolation, the peoples of the north began to have access to metals, fabrics, and new techniques through land and river routes. This contact, although limited, planted in the northerners the desire to reach more distant lands and seek riches beyond their borders. However, unlike the peoples who lived in warmer and more fertile regions, the Scandinavians had to face a hostile environment of severe winters, short summers, and a nature that demanded creativity in order to survive. These difficulties forged qualities such as resilience, perseverance, and resourcefulness, characteristics that would later be used in shipbuilding, in the exploration of new territories, and in war. Nordic culture, even before the Viking period, already showed a natural inclination for oral tradition. Poets and storytellers, later known as skalds, kept the memory of past deeds, genealogies, and beliefs alive, passing them from generation to generation. These stories served as a guide to life in an unpredictable world, teaching values such as courage, loyalty, honor, and the importance of leaving behind a name that would be remembered after death. This concept of reputation and personal glory would become central in Viking life, where dying bravely in combat was worth more than living a long and peaceful life. These peoples were not born warriors by choice, but by necessity. Living in lands with few resources forced tribes to constantly fight over territories, and this practice developed military skills and a combative spirit from an early age. Weapons were simple, made of stone, wood, or metal obtained through trade, but their use was efficient and trained from youth. Children learned early how to handle spears and bows, while adults refined techniques that, over time, would become perfected into true arts of war. This collective learning formed the basis of a people accustomed to combat, who would later project that strength beyond their borders. It was in this crucible of harsh climate, isolation, rivalry, and oral tradition that the foundations of what centuries later would be called the Viking Age were born. These northern Germanic tribes carried a unique cultural heritage, with a rich mythology and a social structure that allowed them to adapt and survive. This combination of factors, combined with a spirit of curiosity and a desire for expansion, would lead at the end of the 8th century after Christ these peoples from small isolated clans to sailors and conquerors who would forever change the history of Europe. Before the world came to know the terror and audacity of the great Viking expeditions, life in Scandinavia unfolded in a simple and harsh way, marked by the constant struggle against a hostile environment. The Nordic settlements, long before the first incursions into the British Isles, were small clusters of wooden and turf houses organized near rivers, fjords, and coves that made access to water and fishing easier. These communities were self-sufficient and isolated, surrounded by dense forests and mountains that for much of the year were covered with snow. The landscape shaped not only the appearance of the villages, but also the rhythm of life of those who lived there, imposing a routine based on survival and the maximum use of everything nature offered. Agriculture, although limited, was one of the pillars of these societies. Men and women cultivated barley, rye, and oats, hardy grains that could grow in poor soil and withstand short summers. In some more fertile regions, wheat was also planted, though in smaller quantities. These crops provided rustic bread, porridges, and homemade beer, which was part of the diet and celebrations. Livestock, goats, sheep, cows, and pigs, was raised mainly to supply milk, wool, and meat. However, raising animals depended directly on the ability to store hay during the summer, since the long winters froze the pastures and forced the animals to remain in improvised barns. Each year, the arrival of winter brought with it uncertainty. If the reserves were not enough, both the animals and the people risked dying of hunger. Fishing was another fundamental activity for survival, and from an early time the Norse developed exceptional skills in capturing fish in cold and turbulent seas. Cod, herring, and salmon were the main resources taken from the sea and rivers, used for immediate consumption or dried and stored. This abundance of fish made the sea an extension of the home and consolidated a very strong bond between the communities and the surrounding waters. It was in simple wooden boats that fishermen ventured out, learning to navigate and to read the wind and tides, skills that would later become crucial for voyages that spread across the continent. Climate was a determining factor in every aspect of life. The long and harsh winters forced the population to prepare months in advance. Houses were built to retain heat, often without windows, and with a single room where people and animals shared the same space to preserve warmth during snowstorms. In the summer, work was relentless, as everything possible had to be stored before the land froze again. This alternation between the urgency of summer and the confinement of winter gave the Nordic people a clear sense of planning and resilience, values that would later shape the organization of Viking expeditions. Despite being isolated, these settlements were not primitive in terms of ingenuity. Iron tools, even if scarce, were forged in local workshops, where blacksmiths produced axes, knives, and everyday utensils. The abundant wood was used to build houses, fences, boats, and furniture. Leather obtained from animals was used for clothing, footwear, and carrying items. This ability to create everything from available resources was essential in a land where there was no constant trade or external help. Each village sustained itself with what it produced, and each family needed to know how to work the land, hunt, fish, sow, and defend themselves. Social relationships in these small communities were direct and based on trust. Since the villages were small, everyone knew each other, and every person had a clear role in the functioning of the group. Children were educated from an early age to understand the importance of collective effort and family honor. Men learned to handle weapons, care for livestock, and build boats, while women took charge of planting, weaving, and caring for the household. This balance of roles was vital for survival, as the failure of one family could compromise the entire village. Even in times of peace, military training and vigilance were constant, since raids by rival clans were a permanent threat. The cultural and spiritual landscape of these settlements was also marked by rituals and festivities. At certain times of the year, when harvests were good and the seas were calm, the clans gathered to celebrate with music, drink, and storytelling. It was in these gatherings that storytellers recited oral sagas, keeping alive the legends of gods and heroes and passing on the memory of the people to the younger generations. These moments of celebration helped strengthen collective identity and endure the long months of isolation that followed. Before the beginning of the Viking Age, life was a matter of endurance and constant preparation. This routine of adversity and discipline forged a population accustomed to facing challenges without hesitation. The generations born and raised in these settlements learned to live in harmony with a harsh and unpredictable environment, creating a culture based on courage, honor, and persistence. It was from this severe environment that the first men and women emerged, who years later would raise the sails of their ships toward unknown lands, forever changing the history of the world. Long before the sails of Viking ships cut across the horizon, the beliefs and myths of the Nordic peoples had already formed a symbolic universe that explained life, death, and the phenomena of nature. Norse religion was a rich system deeply tied to the landscape in which they lived, born in forests, mountains, and fjords, without stone temples or sacred books. It was an oral religion, made of stories, songs, and simple rituals, led by priests known as Godi. The foundation of this spirituality was the conviction that the world was nothing but a battlefield between chaotic forces and forces of order, and that the destiny of men, even before birth, was already drawn by the gods. At the center of these beliefs lay the freshness and power of a unique cosmogony. The Norse believed that at the beginning of everything, there was only a void called Ginnungagap. From this void emerged two opposing realms, Niflheim, made of ice and mist, and Muspelheim, dominated by fire. When the heat of Muspelheim met the ice of Niflheim, life arose in the form of the giant Ymir. From Ymir's body, the gods shaped the world. His flesh became earth, his blood transformed into seas, his bones became mountains, and his skull became the sky. At the center of this world stood the great tree Yggdrasil, a colossal tree whose roots and branches held together the 9 realms of existence, including Asgard, home of the gods, and Midgard, the world of men. This cyclical and dramatic vision of creation, where everything is born from conflict, shaped Norse thought. The gods of this religion were numerous, but the most remembered were Odin, the god of wisdom, war, and death, and Thor, the protector of humanity and lord of thunder. Odin, often depicted as a cloaked wanderer wearing a wide-brimmed hat, was the father of the gods and sought knowledge at any cost, even sacrificing an eye to drink from the fountain of wisdom. Thor, with his hammer Mjolnir, represented strength and protection against giants and monsters. There was also Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and war, Loki, the god of cunning and chaos, and Tyr, the symbol of courage and honor. For these peoples, the gods were not perfect beings, but entities with virtues and flaws, capable of loving, making mistakes, and fighting like men themselves. This brought the gods closer to their worshippers and made their stories more vivid and intense. The legends also spoke of an inevitable destiny, Ragnarok, the end of times. It was believed that one day the gods would face their enemies in a final battle that would destroy the world, plunging everything into flames and ice, only for it to be reborn again. This concept of an end and rebirth deeply influenced the Viking spirit, which saw death not as the end of life but as a passage. For this reason, courage in battle was the supreme value. Those who died with honor could be taken by the Valkyries to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where they would spend eternity feasting and fighting alongside the gods. Religious rituals were simple but full of meaning. In places considered sacred, such as forests, hills, and standing stones, offerings of food, weapons, and even animal sacrifices were made to please the gods. Some accounts even mention human sacrifices in extreme circumstances, especially to ask for good harvests or victories in battle. These rituals had no fixed calendar and varied according to the needs of the clan and the conditions of the environment. Each village had its own symbols, and during times of celebration, music and poetry played a central role, narrating heroic deeds and divine adventures. Oral culture played a fundamental role in preserving these stories. Before the establishment of runic writing, knowledge was passed on through sagas. long poems sung by skalds, poets, and chroniclers who traveled between villages. The sagas told stories of heroes, epic battles, vengeance, and impossible loves. These stories kept traditions alive and reinforced the values of society, such as courage, loyalty, and the pursuit of glory. Through them, the young learned what it meant to be a warrior, a chief, or simply someone worthy of being remembered. This mythology shaped the mentality that would later define the Vikings. The idea that life was short and had to be lived intensely made these people seek great deeds to leave a legacy. Death was not something to be feared, but a natural consequence, and if it came in battle, it was even desired. This unshakable courage, combined with faith in a predestined fate, gave the northern warriors a confidence that made them feared on every battlefield they ever knew. This religiosity also explained their boldness in facing unknown seas, for they believed that if destiny was written, nothing could change it. As time passed, these beliefs became the cement that united the clans and gave meaning to life in such a harsh environment. When the first triangular sails appeared on the horizon, carrying men who feared neither death nor the gods of their enemies, the world was facing a people whose spiritual strength was as powerful as their skill with sword and oar. Norse society before and during the Viking Age was structured in a very clear way, with a social organization that reflected the balance between freedom, duty, and hierarchy. In the beginning, there were no absolute kings or centralized states. What existed were self-sufficient clans and villages, linked by kinship, loyalty, and a shared need for protection. At the heart of this organization were family clans, and from them the entire social order unfolded. These clans were small units made up of extended families who worked and lived together, sharing land, boats, tools, and responsibilities. Over time, these groups connected with nearby clans through marriage alliances or defensive pacts, forming larger communities while always maintaining the independence of each nucleus. Power within these clans was concentrated in the figure of the Jarl, the chief. The Jarl was chosen for his ability to lead, his experience in battles, and his capacity to maintain order and justice. He did not rule by imposition, but by the respect he earned, as the system was based much more on honor and prestige than on absolute authority. A Jarl had the duty to protect his people, organize expeditions, judge internal disputes, and represent the village in meetings with other leaders. This role demanded courage and wisdom, as his leadership was constantly put to the test in both times of war and peace. Just below the Jarls were the Carls, the free men who made up most of the Norse population. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and occasional warriors, responsible for sustaining the villages with their work. The Carls had the right to bear arms, participate in local assemblies known as things, and could join raiding and trading expeditions. Although they did not have the power and influence of the Jarls, their freedom made them important citizens in decision-making. Each free man owned his plot of land, his house, and his belongings, and this independence was a deeply valued principle, something that would later influence how these peoples resisted the centralization of power. At the base of this social pyramid were the thralls, the enslaved. These were people captured in battles or purchased in markets from other regions, used to carry out the hardest labor and deprived of political or social rights. The thralls lived under the control of their masters, but in some cases, they could earn their freedom over the years through good behavior or by paying for it. Despite being the lowest class of society, their work was essential for the functioning of the villages, especially in heavy tasks such as large-scale farming, construction, and caring for livestock. Many thralls came from regions that suffered Viking raids, and their presence became increasingly common as the incursions expanded. This social structure was not so rigid as to prevent mobility. A Carl could, for example, become a Jarl if he acquired wealth, allies, and prestige in battle. Similarly, a thrall could ascend and become a free man. This flexibility, though limited, made Norse society more dynamic than others of the same period. What determined a person's value was not only their birth, but also their courage, skill, and loyalty to the clan. The most important collective decisions were made in assemblies called things. These meetings brought together free men from the village or the region to discuss laws, resolve disputes, and make decisions that affected the community. There was no written system of laws, but oral rules, passed down through generations, recited by those with good memory. In these assemblies, justice was exercised publicly, and everyone had a voice. This model of participatory governance was one of the first examples of direct democracy in Europe, and would later influence political systems in later centuries. The family system was also central to this structure. The family was not limited to parents and children, but included all close and distant relatives. The clan was a living, collective organism, where individual interests were always subordinated to the good of the group. The honor of one person was the honor of the entire family, and any shameful act could bring dishonor to everyone. This collective notion of honor was reflected in codes of conduct that shaped society, valuing a person's word, loyalty, and vengeance as a way to restore justice when it was violated. Over the centuries, these villages grew and became interconnected, and the leadership of the Jarls began to strengthen, planting the first seeds of future Scandinavian kingdoms. Yet even with this gradual transformation, the social foundation remained the same. Jarls leading, carls producing and fighting, and thralls carrying out the hardest labor. It was this simple and efficient order that allowed communities to survive in one of the harshest environments in Europe, and that shaped the character of those who would later be known as Vikings. This system not only sustained life in the villages, but also prepared these communities to become units of combat and exploration. When conditions changed and opportunities for expansion arose, this same social structure was the force that enabled the Vikings to cross seas and establish new lands, carrying with them their values and way of life. The transition from a people isolated in villages to a civilization capable of crossing oceans began with a silent transformation, the mastery of navigation. Long before they became feared conquerors, the Norse developed a deep knowledge of the waters around them. Living in a land filled with fjords, lakes, and frozen seas, they learned to use the sea as a road and to create boats capable of gliding with speed and stability through unpredictable currents. The need to find food, exchange goods with distant villages, and explore the unknown made the boat the centerpiece of all Norse culture. Without this intimate relationship with navigation, the Viking Age would never have been born. The first boats built by the Norse were small vessels, made of wood with overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, and corked with wool and resin to keep the water out. They were light and narrow, suitable for fishing and for sailing in rivers or close to the coast. But as the need to travel farther grew, new techniques were perfected. Learning came from observing nature, from the flexible wood of the forests, and from the ability to create a hull that could withstand not only the impact of waves, but also be carried over land when necessary. From this practical engineering would be born centuries later the most famous naval invention of the Middle Ages, the drakkar ship. The drakkar, which would later become known as the dragon ship, was a masterpiece of engineering for its time. With a long, narrow, and extremely flexible hull, it could slice through the waters at incredible speed, powered by rows of oars and a square sail that made the most of the wind. Its shallow draft was an extraordinary feature. It could enter rivers and narrow channels, allowing surprise attacks far from the coast. This meant that the Vikings were not limited to open seas, but could strike deep into the heart of towns and monasteries that believed they were safe because they were far from the shore. These ships were also light enough that warriors could carry them over land between rivers or lakes, a technique known as portage. This made it impossible to predict where and when attacks could occur, as the ships seemed able to appear out of nowhere. The very design of the drakkar reflected the Viking mindset: speed, versatility, and adaptability. With them, the horizon ceased to be a barrier and became an invitation. Another factor behind the Norse naval excellence was collective skill. Building a ship involved the entire clan. Men cut specific trees, dried and shaped the wood. Blacksmiths made nails and tools. Women wove the wool sails, waterproofed with animal fat, and everyone participated in smaller tasks. This process strengthened social bonds and gave each member a sense of belonging. When the ship was finally launched, it carried not just warriors, but the collective effort of an entire village. With these advances, journeys began to extend beyond usual distances. First came explorations to neighboring villages and nearby coasts. Then came bolder voyages to distant islands and growing trade routes. Each trip increased knowledge of winds, stars, and ocean currents, and this knowledge was passed orally from generation to generation. The Norse became masters of sailing without a compass, using the sun, stars, and even the color of the waters to navigate. This intimacy with the sea was rare in Europe at the time and made their future expansion possible. When the first armed groups began to use these ships for attacks, their tactical superiority proved unmatched. Entire towns were caught by surprise because no one expected a ship to travel up shallow rivers or arrive so quickly. The Dracars were silent when they needed to be, deadly when they appeared in formation, and after the raid, they disappeared as quickly as they had come. It was through this combination of technology and strategy that the Norse began to write the first chapter of their fame. The ships were not just weapons, but cultural symbols. Many of them were adorned with dragon or serpent heads on the prow, an aesthetic and spiritual choice. It was believed that these figures drove away evil spirits and terrified enemies, creating an image of power that went beyond the physical. When a Viking fleet appeared in the distance, the reflection of the sails on the water and the carved figures on the wood seemed like monsters rising from the fog. This image was etched into the memory of all medieval Europe and is one of the reasons why the name of the Vikings became synonymous with fear. For centuries, these vessels would be the greatest weapon and legacy of the Norse. Thanks to them, they reached distant lands, conquered cities, founded kingdoms, and changed the history of the world. Without mastery of the seas, the Viking Age might never have happened. The event that history records as the official beginning of the Viking Age took place in the summer of the year 793 after Christ, when a group of Norse warriors landed on the island of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. Until that moment, the presence of the Scandinavian peoples had been felt only through small commercial contacts or occasional raids. But that attack would change everything. It was fast, brutal, and completely unexpected, inaugurating a period of more than 2 centuries in which the name Viking would become synonymous with terror throughout Europe. Lindisfarne was a monastery famous for its religious relics and accumulated wealth. Built in an isolated location, without fortifications and protected only by monks, it seemed a safe target for men who lived from the sea and had no fear of challenging foreign lands. That morning, when the triangular sails appeared on the horizon, no one could imagine what was about to happen. The monks, accustomed to tranquility, may have thought they were traders. However, within a few hours, the coast was overtaken by screams, flames, and blood. The Vikings disembarked from their ships armed with axes, spears, and swords, invaded the monastery, killed or enslaved the monks, destroyed altars, and took everything of value: gold, silver, richly decorated books, and food. The attack was so violent that when the news spread, it shocked all of Christendom. Chroniclers of the time wrote that it seemed like a divine punishment. In truth, it was the announcement that a new power had arisen in the north. What made Lindisfarne so symbolic was the boldness and the strategic choice. Attacking a religious center was not only an act of seeking wealth, but also a message. The Norse were unafraid to challenge any authority, not even the Christian Church, which was the greatest spiritual and political force in Western Europe. For the Vikings, an isolated monastery full of valuable objects and protected only by peaceful men was the perfect target. In the years that followed, similar attacks would be repeated in other coastal locations, showing that this incursion had not been an isolated event, but the beginning of an era of expansion. The reasons for this offensive were rooted in the Scandinavian reality of the time. The population in northern Europe was growing, and local resources were no longer enough to sustain all the clans. Arable land was limited, winters long, and famine constant. In a culture that valued courage and the pursuit of wealth and fame, young warriors saw in maritime voyages an opportunity to win glory and bring prosperity to their villages. Raiding was not seen simply as an act of violence, but as a legitimate way to survive and prosper. And with the Drakkar ships, the seas ceased to be barriers and became pathways. Lindisfarne also introduced a new kind of fear in Europe. Until then, cities and monasteries close to the coast considered the sea a natural protection, but after this attack, it became clear that the Vikings could appear at any moment, from unknown places, and disappear just as quickly. The mobility of the Drakkars meant that no place near the sea was safe. The enemy was invisible until the moment of attack, and when they came, there was no time to react. This psychological terror spread throughout the continent and shaped the Vikings' reputation. After the raid, the men returned home carrying treasures, food, and captives. This success served as an incentive for new expeditions. as it showed other clans that there were rich and poorly defended lands beyond the horizon. The result was an escalation of attacks. Monasteries, villages, and ports became frequent targets. The British Isles, the coast of France, and nearby regions became the first focus of this expansion. In a short time, what had begun as small raids turned into large organized campaigns, with hundreds of warriors taking part. Lindisfarne was, therefore, the moment when the world understood the scale of what the Norse would be capable of doing. This action not only marked the beginning of the Viking Age, but also established the pattern that would characterize this people: speed, strategy, courage, and an insatiable appetite for wealth and territory. In less than a century after this event, the Vikings would evolve from mere raiders to colonizers and builders of kingdoms in foreign lands. But it all began there, on the morning when the sea brought wooden dragons and the north made the world tremble. After the attack on Lindisfarne, England and the entire region of the British Isles became one of the main targets of Viking expansion. The success of that first raid showed all the northern clans that the coasts of the islands were rich, poorly defended, and full of monasteries and isolated villages that could be attacked quickly and abandoned before any army had time to react. Thus began a sequence of decades in which the Vikings turned the North Sea into an open highway, using their drakkar ships to cross the waters and launch offensives in unexpected places. This was not a war of ideology, it was a combination of survival and ambition. In a world where fertile lands in Scandinavia were scarce and famine could strike in any winter, setting out on expeditions was both a practical solution and an opportunity to grow wealthy. The motivations for these campaigns were clear and linked to economic and social factors. On one hand, there was the urgent need for better land to sustain a growing population. Scandinavia did not have vast fields like England or France, and the climate imposed constant limitations. On the other hand, the Vikings also sought portable wealth: gold, silver, jewels, fine fabrics, and tools that only existed in more developed regions. Each successful raid brought prosperity to the clan and strengthened the position of a leader among his men. In addition, the incursions offered the chance to capture enslaved people, who would be taken back to Scandinavia or sold in markets in other parts of Europe, and even in Constantinople, where they were highly valued. These voyages were also, in a way, a rite of passage. Young men who wanted to prove themselves as warriors left their villages in search of deeds that would earn them respect and fame. Returning home with wealth and stories of battles was not only a personal achievement, but a source of pride for the family and the clan. This quest for glory helped keep the cycle of expeditions alive, as each generation was inspired by the previous one. At the same time, Norse chiefs realized that organizing larger, more coordinated attacks could bring much greater rewards than isolated raids. That was how small fleets of boats turned into true armadas. As the years went by, strategies became more sophisticated. The Vikings began to spend the winter in the British Isles themselves, building fortified camps known as long forts, from which they organized attacks throughout the year. These camps were built close to rivers and natural harbors, allowing easy access to the inland regions. As a result, the expeditions ceased to be quick and temporary and became permanent. In several regions, raiders turned into settlers, establishing homes, marrying local women, and giving rise to mixed communities. Expansion was also driven by the political divisions within England and Ireland at the time. Local kingdoms were constantly at war with each other, which made the incursions easier, as the Vikings encountered little organized resistance. Without unified defense, the attacks were devastating. Wealthy monasteries such as those at Iona and Jarrow suffered the same fate as Lindisfarne, and coastal villages were destroyed or forced to pay tribute to avoid being attacked. This tribute became known as Danegeld, literally the money of the Danes, and became a steady source of wealth for the invaders. Over time, some Vikings realized that there were more advantages in controlling territories than simply plundering them. Thus, they began to establish permanent settlements, giving rise to regions that would become known as the Danelaw in English territory, particularly in the areas that today correspond to northern and eastern England. These regions came to be governed by Norse laws and customs, influencing the language, architecture, and even local traditions. In cities such as York, which they called Jorvik, real urban centers of Viking influence emerged. The effects of this presence were profound. Beyond the fear and destruction caused by the attacks, The Vikings brought their skills in navigation, trade, and social organization to the regions they occupied. Their influence can still be seen today in city names, vocabulary, and even genetic traces in the local population. But at that historical moment, for the peoples living under constant threat, the name Viking represented only destruction and insecurity. With the British Isles under constant pressure, the Vikings proved that they were far more than occasional raiders. They were strategists, colonizers, and merchants who were quickly learning to exploit not only the seas, but also the political weaknesses of each region. This combination of naval mobility, courage, and strategic intelligence turned Viking expansion into an unprecedented phenomenon in medieval Europe. Between the 8th and 9th centuries after Christ, when Viking attacks intensified and spread throughout northern Europe, legendary figures emerged who shaped history and popular imagination. These men and women were not only warriors, but leaders who embodied the values of Norse culture: courage, cunning, honor, and ambition. Their names crossed the centuries, preserved in oral sagas and later in medieval manuscripts that blended real events with mythical elements. Among them, no name resonates more strongly than Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most celebrated heroes of the Viking Age. Ragnar Lothbrok, whose nickname means hairy breeches, is a figure who blurs the line between history and legend. Many sources suggest that he may have been inspired by more than one real warrior chieftain merged into a single heroic character in the sagas. Ragnar was described as a charismatic leader and brilliant strategist, capable of assembling great fleets and attacking regions that no one else dared to touch. The sagas tell of his campaigns against France and England, highlighting the siege of Paris in the year 845 after Christ, when he led an assault with hundreds of ships that terrified the Franks. Unable to withstand his strength, the Frankish rulers paid a heavy ransom for him to leave, a classic example of the Viking tactic of using speed and surprise to win without necessarily destroying everything. Beyond his military achievements, Ragnar became a symbol of individual courage. According to legend, he constantly sought out impossible feats to prove his worth to the gods. His death also became an epic story. Captured by the Anglo-Saxon King Ella, he was allegedly thrown into a pit of snakes, facing death without fear and prophesying the revenge of his sons, who would later fulfill that promise with the great heathen army. Among Ragnar's descendants, warriors who also became legendary stood out. Bjorn Ironside, whose name meant iron flank, inherited his father's adventurous spirit. He led expeditions not only in England, but also into the Mediterranean, sailing to regions such as Italy and even North Africa, something unthinkable for the time. The sagas say that Bjorn founded settlements and became a king in Sweden, consolidating his fame as an explorer and conqueror. Another legendary name linked to Ragnar's family is Lagertha, a warrior whose story defies the gender norms of her time. Medieval sources describe Lagertha as a skjaldmö, a woman who fought alongside men on the battlefield, demonstrating extraordinary skill with sword and spear. Her courage so impressed Ragnar that he took her as his wife. Although the accounts mix myth and reality, they show that in Norse society there was space for warrior women, something that recent archaeological studies have confirmed by finding female graves with weapons and clear signs of military status. Ragnar's sons, known collectively as the Sons of Ragnar, played a crucial role in Viking expansion. Ivar the Boneless, perhaps the most famous of them, led the already mentioned Great Heathen Army, an army of thousands of warriors that devastated the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the late 9th century after Christ. Ivar, despite suffering from a condition that prevented him from walking normally, was feared for his strategic intelligence and cruelty. His ability to plan battles and manipulate political alliances made him one of the most formidable commanders of his time. Other warriors, such as Ubba and Halfdan, also left their mark on history, leading campaigns that secured vast territories and riches for the Vikings. These family leaders transformed Viking expansion into an organized phenomenon, moving from isolated raids to military operations that reshaped the political structure of the British Isles. These legendary figures are fundamental to understanding how the Vikings, in just a few generations, managed to transform themselves into one of the most influential peoples of the medieval period. Their names were whispered with fear and respect by their enemies, and admired as examples of bravery within their own clans. The saga of these leaders crossed the boundaries of their time, becoming part of a legacy that still fascinates today. And behind each legend was a real truth, a culture unafraid of the unknown, that sought glory in life and believed that the destiny of a warrior was written with deeds that would echo forever. After the first raids and quick expeditions, the Vikings realized that the British Isles were more than just a target for occasional attacks. They were an opportunity to occupy, exploit, and transform strategic positions into permanent bases. Scotland, Ireland, and England became the heart of this second phase of expansion, marked not only by violence, but also by the consolidation of settlements and the fusion of cultures. This new stage changed the political and social landscape of the islands, creating a lasting Norse presence that would influence history for centuries. In Scotland, the attacks began in the northern islands, such as the Orkneys and Shetlands, which were ideal points to be used as navigation outposts. These locations soon became permanent Viking bases. Over time, entire families migrated to these islands, establishing farming villages and ports, displacing local populations or integrating with them. The same occurred in the Hebrides and in areas of the Scottish west coast. These settlements gave the Vikings control over vital sea routes and ensured that their ships could quickly cross between the North Atlantic and the Irish Sea. In Ireland, history followed a similar course, but with a peculiarity. The Vikings ended up founding some of the most important cities in the country. By the mid-9th century after Christ, Dublin was born as a Viking trading post on the banks of the River Liffey. Other cities such as Waterford, Limerick, and Cork were also created by them. Initially, these places served only as fortified camps to spend the winter and store treasures, known as long forts, but over time they became permanent urban centers where trade flourished. In these cities, the Norse traded enslaved people, leather, wool, metals, and agricultural products, connecting Ireland to trade routes that reached Scandinavia, Russia, and Constantinople. England, however, was the territory most deeply impacted by Viking presence. After decades of devastating attacks, a massive Norse army, known as the Great Heathen Army, landed in 865 after Christ. Unlike small expeditions, this was an organized force, formed by hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. The goal was no longer just plunder, but conquest. Over the following years, they defeated several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and began to take control of vast areas, especially in the north and east of England. From this process emerged a region called Danelaw, meaning land under Danish law. Within Danelaw, life came to be governed by Norse customs, with assemblies called things, their own laws, and Scandinavian chiefs in command. The city of York, which they called Jorvik, became the capital of this domain. Streets, markets, and workshops in Jorvik reflected the blending of the two cultures, and the city became a prosperous center of trade and production. The influences of this period are visible even today in the English language, especially in words of Norse origin, in village and town names ending in by and thorpe, and in local customs. Permanent settlements also changed the social structure of the British Isles. Many Vikings began marrying local women, forming mixed families and consolidating their presence. This coexistence did not eliminate conflicts, but created bonds that made it more difficult to expel them. Over time, the descendants of these settlers no longer saw themselves merely as foreigners, but as part of the land where they lived. This integration made the cultural impact profound and long-lasting. Another important factor was the introduction of new techniques and practices brought by the Norse. They introduced advancements in shipbuilding, in using rivers as trade routes, and in agricultural development in coastal regions. They also brought their legal system and their way of managing communities in a decentralized manner, which influenced local organization. Even the way of waging war changed, as English armies had to adapt to face a mobile, fast, and unpredictable enemy. The Viking presence in the British Isles was not just a period of destruction, but also of transformation. While they caused fear and suffering with their raids, the Scandinavians created cities, established trade routes, and fused cultures. The Danelaw, the founding of Dublin, and the occupation of the northern islands of Scotland are milestones of this legacy. These territories, once only plundered, became strategic centers for new expansions, preparing the Vikings to extend their influence even further, to France, Russia, the Mediterranean, and ultimately to the unknown lands of the North Atlantic. Among the many characteristics that made the Norse peoples unique in the Middle Ages One of the most impressive was their system of laws and assemblies, which revealed a surprising sense of social organization for a culture often remembered only for war. Even in a society driven by survival and conquest, there was a profound respect for rules and legal rituals. The Vikings understood that life in small isolated communities could only be maintained through clear rules, and for that reason they created an oral system of justice that was consolidated in the assemblies known as Thing, or in the case of Iceland, the Althing. These gatherings were the heart of political and legal life in the Viking world, bringing together free men to resolve disputes, judge crimes, and make decisions that affected the entire community. Unlike the centralized kingdoms of Christian Europe, where kings and feudal lords had the final word, in Norse communities, justice was collective. The Thing was held in open spaces, often in elevated places or next to stones considered sacred. Free men had the right to participate, present their cases, and vote on decisions. There were no permanent judges or fixed courts. The person who recited the law was an elder or a law speaker, a man chosen for his memory and deep knowledge of traditions. These laws were not written, but memorized and transmitted orally from generation to generation, preserving a set of rules that regulated everything from disputes over land to serious crimes such as murder and theft. A striking feature of this system was the importance of compensation and honor. Instead of punishing with prisons, the assemblies sought to restore balance between the parties. If someone committed a crime, especially homicide, the first solution was to establish a vergild, meaning a value in goods or silver that had to be paid to the victim's family as a form of reparation. This payment prevented cycles of revenge that could destroy entire communities. If the compensation was rejected, revenge was still allowed as a last resort, but the attempt at agreement always came first. This model reinforced the idea that justice was, above all, a social pact. In the most serious cases, when a person repeatedly disrespected the laws, the maximum punishment was not death but exile. The condemned person was declared outside the law, a status called outlaw, which meant that anyone could kill them without suffering punishment. This exclusion was a devastating sentence, because living outside the protection of the clan and community practically condemned a person to death. This practice reflected the importance of collective belonging in Norse culture. Over time, as communities expanded and contact between clans increased, these assemblies became more structured. In Iceland, where the Vikings established colonies starting in the 9th century after Christ, the Althing was created, a broader and more formal version of the assembly. The Althing brought together representatives of all clans in a large annual meeting that lasted about 2 weeks. During this gathering, political decisions were made, alliances were formed, disputes were judged, and the laws were recited. It was also an important social event, where families exchanged goods, arranged marriages, and resolved pending issues. The Althing is so significant that many historians consider it the oldest parliament in the world in continuous operation. This legal system also shows that Norse culture was not purely violent, as it is often portrayed. On the contrary, there was a collective effort to regulate coexistence and avoid chaos. The law, even though unwritten, was respected, and disobeying it meant placing oneself outside society. The Vikings understood that to prosper in such a difficult environment and to maintain cohesion during their expeditions, there had to be a balance between individual courage and collective discipline. Beyond criminal disputes, these assemblies played a fundamental role in commerce and politics. It was there that alliances for expeditions were discussed, conquered lands were divided, trade rules were established, and even peace agreements with other peoples were negotiated. This tradition contributed to the future formation of the first more centralized Norse states, as it taught the importance of collective decisions and public debate. While in other parts of medieval Europe, the laws were in the hands of kings and clerics, among the Vikings they belonged to the people. This democratic heritage was one of the greatest legacies of Norse societies, a legacy that continued even after Christianity and political centralization profoundly changed life in Northern Europe. Viking culture was far more than battles, blood, and plunder. Behind the image of fierce warriors, there was a society rich in artistic expression, oral tradition, and unique ways of recording memory. In every village and every clan, there was a constant effort to preserve stories, honor ancestors, and create symbols that marked the identity of a people. This cultural heritage spread through different areas: art, runic writing, skaldic poetry, and the tradition of oral sagas. Through these elements we can understand the spiritual and intellectual depth of the Vikings, often overlooked when their history is reduced only to acts of war. Viking art was characterized by its connection to nature and symbolism. Wood carvings, bone and metal engravings, embroidered fabrics, and even the ships themselves carried sinuous forms inspired by animals, serpents, and dragons. These motifs, known as animalistic art, were not merely decoration. They had spiritual value, represented protection, and conveyed stories of myths and heroic deeds. Everyday objects such as shields, helmets, jewelry, and even combs bore these designs, showing that even in difficult times there was room for beauty and aesthetics. Another fascinating element of this culture was skaldic poetry. Skalds were poets and chroniclers who, through the spoken word, recorded the great deeds of kings, warriors, and gods. Their role was similar to that of Celtic bards or medieval troubadours, but the skaldic style was much more complex, filled with elaborate metaphors called kennings. For example, the sea could be described as the road of whales, and a sword as the spark of battle. These poems were not just entertainment. They immortalized the memory of the clan and were passed down from generation to generation as a form of oral archive. In a society without books, collective memory depended on the skill of these poets. Beyond spoken word, the Vikings also developed their own writing system, the runes. The runic alphabet, called futhark, was used mainly to carve short messages on stone, wood, and metal. It was not an extensive literary system, but it had practical and symbolic value. Runes were engraved on weapons, jewelry, and commemorative stones to record names, achievements, oaths, and religious rites. Many of these inscriptions have been preserved on monuments known as rune stones, found throughout Scandinavia and in regions colonized by the Norse. They have become one of the main historical records of the period, revealing names, lineages, and even travel routes. The sagas, epic narratives that mixed reality and myth, were the backbone of oral culture. These stories recounted the deeds of the gods of Asgard, the adventures of legendary heroes, and even real events of battles and explorations. During the long winters, families gathered around the fire to listen to these stories, which taught children, united communities, and kept traditions alive. Each saga conveyed fundamental values such as courage, loyalty, cunning, and respect for ancestors. These narratives were only written down many centuries later, already in Christianized Iceland, and became one of the main modern sources about the Viking world. Music and dance were also part of this cultural heritage. Instruments such as lyres, bone flutes, and skin drums were used during celebrations, and it is believed that music had a ritual role, especially in religious ceremonies. These manifestations helped maintain a spirit of unity in the villages and accompanied festivals celebrating harvests, victories, or alliances. What is most impressive is that, even without large cities or formal academies, Viking culture produced an identity so strong that it managed to survive through the centuries. Much of what we know about them today comes precisely from these cultural expressions, which cross time and remain alive in carvings, runestones, later written accounts, and oral tradition. This cultural dimension shows that the Vikings were not only conquerors, but also creators and storytellers. Behind the image of armed men, there were poets, craftsmen, musicians, and chroniclers who understood that a people's greatest wealth is its memory. This fusion between the brutality of war and the delicacy of art created a unique legacy, capable of influencing Scandinavia for centuries and leaving deep marks on the history of medieval Europe, at a time when much of Europe was subjected to rigid patriarchal structures and women had little space in public life. Viking society stood out for granting women a significantly broader and more respected role. In Norse communities, they were not merely isolated domestic figures. They had a voice within the clan, managed properties, made important decisions during male absence, and, in some cases, even wielded weapons and marched to war alongside men. This differentiated position was part of Viking culture and was directly linked to the context of survival in a harsh environment, where every individual, man or woman, had to be useful to ensure the group's sustenance. In the daily life of the villages, Women were responsible for managing properties, while the men were away on maritime expeditions or in battle. This included supervising crops, handling food and goods, managing enslaved workers, negotiating exchanges, and maintaining order in the household. It was a strategic role, for without this organization, the village would not function. Norse law also granted them rights unusual for the time. They could inherit land, request a divorce, and manage their own property. In cases of divorce, it was common for the woman to take back her dowry and a share of the assets acquired during the marriage, something shocking to many neighboring peoples who were used to stricter submission. But the most fascinating aspect of women's presence in the Viking world goes beyond household management. It was the existence of the so-called skjaldmos, or shield maidens. The sagas describe these women as skilled fighters, trained from a young age to fight with sword, spear, and shield. Although not all Viking women were warriors, those who excelled in this role gained status and respect among men. Recent archaeological excavations have confirmed the existence of these figures. Graves containing female skeletons have been found with weapons, horses, and symbols of military command, showing that some of them indeed held leadership roles on the battlefield. The most famous examples come from the sagas, such as Lagertha, the wife of Ragnar Lothbrok, described as a warrior so fierce that, according to the stories, she helped Ragnar win decisive battles. Another remarkable example is Freydis Eiriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, who is said to have participated in the expeditions to Vineland, North America, facing indigenous warriors and defending the newly founded colony. Even if there are legendary elements in these stories, they reflect a collective imagination that not only accepted but admired female courage. In the spiritual and cultural sphere, women also held prominent roles as priestesses and seeresses, called vulvas. They were responsible for rituals, prophecies, and religious ceremonies, acting as bridges between the world of the gods and that of men. These seeresses carried staffs and performed Seder rites, a mystical practice that sought to foresee the future and influence events. This role gave them enormous respect and decision-making power within the communities. Despite this more flexible scenario, life for women was not easy. Responsibilities were immense, and the social pressure to maintain the clan's honor was as strong for them as it was for men. Living in medieval Scandinavia meant facing a hostile environment in every aspect, from climate to constant warfare. For this reason, female independence came with sacrifice and hard work. Even so, when compared to women of other contemporary peoples, they enjoyed an uncommon degree of freedom. Over time, especially after the Christianization of Scandinavia, this freedom began to diminish, and the norms brought by Christianity restricted female autonomy, gradually reducing the presence of the shield maidens and making the division of roles more rigid. However, during the Viking Age, these women were an active part of the success and expansion of the Norse people, both in the defense and management of their lands and in the battles that marked history. The image of Viking women, therefore, goes far beyond myth. They were guardians of the household and at the same time leaders in critical times. They fought, governed, negotiated, and shaped the destiny of their communities. It is impossible to understand the strength of this people without acknowledging their role as the foundation, and in many cases, as protagonists of the Viking spirit. Although the Vikings are remembered mainly for violent raids and military conquests, one of the main forces behind their expansion was trade. With fast ships and the ability to navigate both open seas and narrow rivers, the Norse created a network of trade routes that connected Scandinavia to practically the entire known world of the Middle Ages. Throughout the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries after Christ, true maritime corridors emerged that carried furs, amber, iron, and enslaved people to distant regions, bringing back silver, silk, spices, wine, and luxury goods in return. This mercantile vocation meant that the Vikings were not only raiders, but also powerful intermediaries between very different civilizations. The routes began in the fjords and makeshift ports of the Norse villages and expanded in two major directions. The first was to the west and south, crossing the North Sea and the Atlantic, passing through the British Isles, the coast of France, and reaching the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean. The second, equally important, went to the east, through the rivers of present-day Russia and Ukraine, reaching the Baltic, Black, and Caspian Seas. This eastern axis opened the way to two destinations that became fundamental in Viking history: Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and Baghdad, the center of the Abbasid Caliphate. Trade with Constantinople was extremely lucrative. Known as the richest city of the Middle Ages, Constantinople offered products the Norse had never seen: silk fabrics, golden icons, valuable coins, wine, and finely crafted jewelry. In return, the Vikings took northern animal furs, walrus ivory, amber, a highly prized resin for jewelry, and enslaved people captured during their expeditions. These Scandinavian merchants and warriors who traveled east were known as Varangians. Many of them, fascinated by Byzantine wealth, offered their services as mercenaries, forming an elite guard in the service of the Byzantine emperor, the famous Varangian Guard. To reach Constantinople, the Varangians used the great river networks of Eastern Europe. The Volga and Dnieper rivers were authentic water highways cutting across vast regions. When they encountered obstacles, such as waterfalls, they dismantled their ships and carried them across the land, reassembling them afterward to continue the journey. This technique required strength and ingenuity, but allowed them to reach lands that other peoples would never dare to visit. Along these routes, they founded trading posts and settlements, many of which later became important cities, such as Kiev and Novgorod. In addition to Constantinople, the Vikings also reached the Islamic world. Following the Volga River, they reached the shores of the Caspian Sea, and from there established trade contacts with the peoples of the Middle East and with the powerful Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Islamic coins found at archaeological sites in Scandinavia show how intense this relationship was. In exchange for furs and enslaved people, they received large quantities of silver, as well as exotic products such as spices, perfumes, and luxurious fabrics. This trade brought wealth and sophisticated objects to villages that had previously lived in simple conditions. Viking markets were spaces of exchange and diversity. In important ports such as Hedeby and Birka, it was possible to find Scandinavian merchants negotiating side by side with Saxons, Franks, Arabs, and Byzantines. These cities, located at strategic points on the Baltic Sea, became cosmopolitan centers where cultures, languages, and religions intersected. It was in these places that goods were gathered, prepared, and redistributed to other destinations. This commercial aspect was responsible for profoundly transforming Norse culture. Constant contact with other peoples brought new ideas, technologies, and even religious elements. Many Scandinavian craftsmen began to imitate foreign styles, creating jewelry and weapons inspired by the luxury of the Mediterranean and the East. Furthermore, the wealth acquired through trade allowed some leaders to strengthen their power, using these resources to build military and political influence, thus beginning the process of forming the first centralized Scandinavian kingdoms. Therefore, the Vikings were not only invaders, they were also explorers and merchants, who created a network of connections between Northern Europe and the richest civilizations of their time. This ability to trade and adapt to local customs made their influence extend far beyond raiding. It shaped the economic and cultural relations of the Middle Ages in a way that can still be traced today through coins, jewelry, and objects found in archaeological excavations throughout Europe and Asia. With the expansion of maritime and river routes, the Vikings created true commercial hubs that served as vital points for trade, redistribution of goods, and cultural encounters. 3 cities in particular became symbols of this economic activity and the urban flourishing of Scandinavia: Hedeby, Birka, and Kattegat. These places were not just markets, they were spaces where merchants, sailors, and artisans from the north and south of Europe gathered, turning Viking economy into something far more sophisticated than simple raiding. Behind every object unearthed in excavations of these cities lies a story of journeys, bargaining, and contact between very different worlds. Hedeby, strategically located between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, in what is now northern Germany, was one of the most important Viking trade ports. It served as a connection point between west and east, where goods could be transported overland from one sea to the other in a relatively short distance. This location made Hedeby a dynamic, cosmopolitan center, where products from Scandinavia, continental Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and even the Arab world came together. Archaeological excavations have revealed objects such as Islamic coins, glass beads, exotic fabrics, and refined weapons, clear evidence that the city was integrated into extensive trade networks. Hedeby was not just a marketplace, it was also a place of production with workshops that made tools, jewelry, and ships. Birka, in present-day Sweden, was another great trade center. Founded on the island of Björkö in Lake Mälaren, it had direct access to the Baltic Sea and became one of the first planned towns in Scandinavia. Its importance came not only from trade, but also from its administrative role. Birka was a meeting point for merchants and a place where laws and agreements were established. Northern animal furs, iron, amber, and enslaved people were traded there, while luxury goods arrived from the south and east. Birka was so important that it attracted Christian missionaries long before Scandinavia officially converted, highlighting its cosmopolitan character. Like Hedeby, Birka declined at the end of the Viking Age, but left an impressive legacy of cultural interaction. Kattegat, although more legendary than historically documented in the way it is depicted in the sagas, symbolically represents this type of urban and commercial hub. Located in a narrow body of water between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, Kattegat, meaning cat's hole, a reference to the narrow passage, has always been a strategic region for controlling maritime routes. The idea of Kattegat as a major mercantile city symbolizes the importance of these ports as places where all the wealth obtained in expeditions was traded, redistributed, and negotiated. Even if archaeology does not confirm a single large city by that exact name, there is no doubt that several coastal communities in the region operated in a similar way, consolidating Norse dominance over navigation and trade. What united these centers was diversity. In these cities, one could see Arab merchants bringing silver, Franks offering wine and fabrics, Anglo-Saxons with weapons and tools, alongside Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians trading everything they could. This multicultural environment created a constant flow of knowledge. New construction techniques, artistic patterns, languages, and religions mixed. For many, these ports were the first places where they could see objects from regions as distant as Baghdad or Constantinople. This commercial network not only brought wealth, but also culturally transformed Scandinavia, connecting it to the rest of the medieval world. The prosperity of these cities strengthened Viking social structure. Wealthier jarls used the profits from trade to fund larger expeditions, acquire better weapons, and, little by little, create more centralized systems of power. This was a decisive factor in the formation of the first Scandinavian kingdoms, because those who controlled these ports controlled the economy. The importance of these cities, therefore, went beyond the simple exchange of goods. They shaped the politics and society of the Viking world. Even after the era of great invasions began to decline, the legacy of Hedeby, Birka, and the Kattegat region remained. Their models of urban and commercial organization paved the way for the transformation of Scandinavia from a land of isolated clans to more complex societies integrated into the great trade networks of medieval Europe. As the Vikings consolidated their routes through the North Sea and the Atlantic, another path began to gain importance and define a new chapter in Norse expansion: navigation along the great rivers of Eastern Europe. These rivers became true liquid highways connecting the Baltic Sea to the heart of Eastern Europe, to the Black Sea, and finally to Constantinople and the Middle East. The Scandinavians who ventured into these lands were known as Varangians, and their impact was so profound that it gave rise to cities, permanent trade routes, and even a new political power that would become fundamental to the history of the region. The formation of what later became known as Kievan Rus. The Varangians departed mainly from what is now Sweden. Using their shallow draft ships, they were able to navigate the rivers Dvina, Volkhov, Dnieper, and Volga. When they encountered waterfalls or stretches of land, they dismantled or dragged their ships overland to another waterway, resuming the journey. This unusual skill allowed them to reach distant places that other peoples could not. Along these routes, they established fortified trading posts that over time grew into important cities. These posts served both as centers for commercial exchange and as defensive bases to protect merchants during their long voyages. From the 9th century after Christ onward, the Varangians began to exert increasing political influence over the local Slavic and Finno-Ugric populations. These peoples saw the Norse as disciplined warriors and experienced navigators capable of providing protection in a territory marked by constant disputes. A complex relationship developed, at first as merchants and mercenaries, later as rulers. According to the primary chronicle, a medieval document that recounts these events, it was a group of Varangians led by a chieftain named Rurik, who founded the city of Novgorod. After his death, his successors expanded their control to the south, establishing a new capital in Kiev. With Kiev as their center, they consolidated an extremely profitable trade route known as from the Varangians to the Greeks, which connected the Baltic Sea to Constantinople. This city prospered and became the base of a power that would come to be known as Kievan Rus. There, the Norse intermingled with the local peoples, adopting customs and languages, and formed a new elite that controlled both trade and regional politics. Kiev became one of the most important economic hubs of the era, acting as an intermediary between goods from the north, furs, honey, enslaved people, ivory, and the luxuries of the Byzantine Empire, gold, wine, silk. The Norse presence in the region also left a deep mark on military culture. The Varangians were feared for their discipline and bravery, and soon began to be hired by Byzantine emperors themselves as personal guards, forming the famous Varangian Guard. This elite corps was composed mainly of Scandinavians, and later of Anglo-Saxons who fled England after the Norman conquest. The Varangian Guard became synonymous with loyalty and ferocity, protecting the emperor in battles and in the streets of Constantinople. In addition to their economic and military impact, the Varangians contributed to the formation of a new cultural identity in the region. Contact with Slavs and Byzantines brought architectural, religious, and administrative elements that shaped the future cities. This process of cultural fusion is considered by many historians to be the beginning of the formation of the Russian state. It is important to highlight that the Viking presence in Eastern Europe was not only about domination. Over the decades, many of these Scandinavians abandoned raiding and settled as merchants and rulers, marrying local women and integrating with Slavic populations. Thus, the boundary between Vikings and locals slowly disappeared. By the 10th century after Christ, Kiev was already a stable center, governed by a dynasty of Varangian origin, but heavily influenced by Slavic and Byzantine culture. This Viking trajectory in the east reveals a lesser-known side of their history. They were not only destroyers, but builders of routes, cities, and alliances. The founding of Kiev and the control of riverine routes marked an important transition, from unpredictable raiders to organizers of trade networks that linked northern Europe to the heart of the Mediterranean and the East. As the Vikings consolidated their river routes in Eastern Europe, they expanded their horizons to regions that had once seemed unreachable for the peoples of the north. Using rivers such as the Dnieper and the Volga, they reached the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, connecting themselves to two of the most powerful centers of the Middle Ages, the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. This expansion not only increased their wealth through trade, but also profoundly transformed the role of the Scandinavians on the international stage. From raiders, they became mercenaries and strategic allies of empires that valued their skill in combat. Contact with the Byzantine Empire was one of the milestones of this phase. Constantinople, the capital, was an astonishing city for the Norse. Rich, protected by imposing walls and full of markets, temples and palaces, it was called Miklagard by them, meaning the great city. It did not take long for the Vikings to realize that they could gain much more as allies than as enemies. From the 10th century after Christ onward, many Varangian chieftains began to trade directly with the Byzantines, bringing northern goods such as furs, walrus ivory, enslaved people and honey, and in return, bringing silk, wine, gold, and valuable coins. This exchange was not limited to goods. It also involved services. It was in this context that the famous Varangian Guard was born, an elite troop composed of Norse warriors hired to protect the Byzantine emperor. These men were chosen for their loyalty and bravery, characteristics that became legendary. Unlike many local mercenaries, the Varangians had no ties to the internal politics of Byzantium, which made them ideal allies for the emperor's direct protection. Armed with long swords and axes, the guardsmen were feared on the battlefield and respected within the imperial palace. Byzantine chroniclers recount that these men were tireless, and that once they swore loyalty, they maintained their commitment until death. Meanwhile, along the Volga and into the Caspian Sea, the Vikings also came into contact with the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. These merchants took goods from the north to regions such as Baghdad. then one of the largest cultural and economic centers in the world. In return, they received mainly silver, which became abundant in Scandinavia thanks to these transactions, as well as fine fabrics, spices, and exotic objects never before seen in the north. The clearest proof of this connection is the thousands of Arabic coins found in archaeological sites in Sweden, Denmark, and other Scandinavian regions. This network of contacts with Byzantium and the Caliphate not only increased the wealth of the Vikings, but also brought cultural changes. Many warriors who served as mercenaries in the Varangian Guard returned home carrying with them military techniques learned in Byzantium, new styles of weapons, and stories about the grandeur of that city. These influences helped to elevate the level of military and political organization in Scandinavia, as contact with great empires taught the Norse how to deal with more complex structures of power. It is interesting to note that unlike in the western regions of Europe where the Vikings preferred to attack and occupy, their behavior in the east was different. First commerce, then alliances and integration. The wealth and opportunities offered by the Eastern empires were so great that it was far more advantageous to participate in the system than to destroy it. This strategic intelligence reveals a less violent and more pragmatic side of the Viking people, showing that they knew how to adapt their tactics according to circumstances. With this expansion, the Vikings ceased to be just a people of the north and became protagonists in a global network of exchanges. Their ships crossed seas and rivers carrying not only goods, but also information, techniques, and cultures. And although they are remembered for the violence of their first attacks, it was this ability to navigate and negotiate that guaranteed them a lasting influence in regions as distant as Constantinople and Baghdad, marking the peak of Viking power in Eastern Europe. When the Vikings turned their eyes to the coast of what is now France, they found a fertile region full of navigable rivers, with wealthy but poorly defended towns and monasteries. From the end of the 8th century after Christ, these lands became frequent targets of raids, especially along the Seine River, which served as a direct gateway to Paris. For decades, expeditions mainly from Denmark and Norway sailed up the great French rivers, plundering cities and demanding tribute in exchange for temporary peace. This constant pressure forced the Frankish kings to look for solutions to stop the Viking advance, but at the same time, it opened the door to an agreement that would forever change the history of Western Europe, the creation of Normandy. In the year 911 after Christ, after years of conflict, King Charles, known as Charles the Simple, made an agreement with the Viking leader Rollo, also called Hrolfr. Rollo had led major attacks on the cities of the region and was an experienced, respected and feared commander. The treaty, known as the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, established that Rollo and his men would receive a vast stretch of land along the Seine River, from its mouth to the city of Rouen, in exchange for ending the attacks and protecting that part of the kingdom against further Viking incursions. This agreement marked the beginning of the formal integration of the Vikings into French territory. With this concession of land, Normandy was born, literally, land of the Northmen. From that moment on, the former invaders began to settle permanently in the region. Rollo and his descendants gradually adopted the local language, Old French and Christianity, integrating themselves into Frankish culture. However, they also maintained many aspects of Norse tradition, such as their naval skills, their war tactics, and their independent spirit. This cultural fusion gave rise to a new people, the Normans. Normandy quickly became one of the most dynamic and militarily powerful regions of medieval France. Its ports turned into commercial hubs, and its population, the result of the mix between Scandinavians and Franks, stood out for its expertise in shipbuilding and military discipline. In just a few generations, the Normans were fully integrated into the political landscape of Western Europe, yet they still carried with them the warrior heritage of their northern ancestors. The impact of this agreement was immense. Viking attacks on that part of France dropped dramatically, and Normandy began to act as a natural barrier against further incursions. On the other hand, the power of the Normans grew to the point that it went beyond the borders of France. In 1066 after Christ, descendants of these first Norman Vikings conquered England at the famous Battle of Hastings, led by William the Conqueror. Thus, a people who had arrived as invaders centuries earlier now became one of the main builders of the new European political landscape. The creation of Normandy clearly shows the transformation of the Vikings over time. From feared raiders, they became legitimate rulers and agents of cultural integration. This transition was only possible because from the beginning, the Norse had the ability to adapt, adopt new cultures, and take advantage of the opportunities offered by the kingdoms they once attacked. By receiving land and responsibilities, they proved to be not only brutal warriors, but also leaders and builders of a new type of society. Normandy remained a symbol of the fusion between two worlds, that of Norse traditions and that of Frankish culture. This heritage, born from the agreements between Rollo and Charles the Simple, would leave deep marks on the history of Europe, influencing politics, language, architecture, and even future expansion into other regions, such as Sicily and the Mediterranean, always carrying the mark of Viking audacity, transformed into organized power. The Viking expansion was not limited to European coasts and the great rivers of the East. One of this people's boldest and most decisive adventures was the exploration of the North Atlantic, a hostile, frozen, and unpredictable sea that few dared to face. Driven by a spirit of discovery, by the need for new lands, and by the courage that characterized their culture, the Vikings launched their ships beyond known routes and opened the way for the colonization of remote territories, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and later Greenland. This maritime epic not only expanded the geographical limits of the known world in the Middle Ages, but also forever changed the map of human expansion in the Atlantic. The first step in this direction was the settlement of the Faroe Islands, an isolated archipelago located between Norway, Iceland, and Scotland. It is believed that the first Viking settlements on these islands occurred between the 8th century and the early 9th century after Christ. The Faroes offered pastures for sheep farming and a strategic location as a support point for longer voyages. The settlers built small farming villages and used the islands as temporary bases for fishing and hunting seabirds. Its location, although difficult, was perfect for those who wanted to push further and further westward. The next step was even more ambitious: the colonization of Iceland. Around the year 870 after Christ, Norwegian sailors began to arrive on this volcanic island, attracted by stories of fertile lands and an abundance of fish. Iceland, until then practically uninhabited, began to receive waves of settlers, including entire families fleeing internal disputes in Norway. Within a few decades, the entire Icelandic coast was populated, giving rise to organized villages that created a stable society. The distance from continental Europe made Iceland an independent center, and there the famous Althing was born, one of the oldest assemblies in the world, which organized the political life of the colony. Furthermore, oral tradition was strongly preserved in this territory, and it was in Iceland that centuries later, the Viking sagas would finally be written down. But the boldness of the Vikings did not stop there. At the end of the 10th century after Christ, led by Eric the Red, they went even further, reaching the coasts of Greenland. This icy and inhospitable island, with few fertile valleys and dominated by glaciers, seemed like an impossible destination. However, for the Vikings it was a new frontier. Eric, who had been exiled from Iceland after a crime, organized an expedition and founded the first permanent settlements. These settlements survived for centuries, relying on cattle raising, seal hunting, and fishing. Despite the hardships, Greenland became an integral part of Norse trade routes and a starting point for an even more impressive journey. What makes these voyages exceptional is the technology and maritime knowledge of the Vikings. With their drakars and nars, larger, wider ships used for transport, they managed to sail icy seas guided only by the sun, the stars, and their reading of ocean currents. Unpredictable winds, storms, and intense cold were not obstacles. For a people who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a path, these voyages became a natural part of expansion. Beyond the practical aspect, the colonization of the North Atlantic also had symbolic meaning. Each new island conquered was a sign of courage, endurance, and adaptability. These isolated colonies were extremely organized, as they depended on self-sufficiency. Short harvests during summer, intensive fishing, whale hunting, and stocks prepared to endure long winters. This harsh life shaped very cohesive communities, with their own laws and a strong sense of solidarity. The discoveries of the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland opened the doors to one of the greatest Norse achievements. The arrival in North America, long before Christopher Columbus, when Leif Erikson reached Vinland. This would be the next stage of a movement that transformed the Vikings not only into conquerors, but into explorers of the unknown. In the North Atlantic, they showed the medieval world that the ocean was not a limit, but an invitation. At the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th century after Christ, an extraordinary achievement firmly consolidated the Vikings' reputation as the greatest navigators of their time: the arrival in North America about 500 years before the voyages of Christopher Columbus. This feat was led by Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, the same man who had founded the Greenland settlements. Driven by curiosity, the need to find new fertile lands, and the fearless spirit that defined the Norse people, the Vikings crossed unknown seas and became the first Europeans to set foot on American soil. The Icelandic sagas preserve this story in detail. According to the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was the first to sight unknown lands to the west, after being lost in a storm in the North Atlantic while trying to reach Greenland. He did not go ashore, but his story sparked the interest of other navigators. Leif Erikson, upon hearing the account, decided to organize an expedition to explore these new lands. He prepared a Nar-type ship, designed for long journeys and carrying supplies, and set out from Greenland with a group of companions. The crossing was risky, but the winds and the nautical expertise of the Norse led them to a series of new regions. First, they reached a land covered with stones and ice, which they named Helluland, probably Baffin Island. Then they continued to a land of dense forests and flat plains, which they called Markland, possibly today's Labrador coast. Finally, they reached a more fertile land with a milder climate, open fields, and abundant wild grapes. This region was named Vinland, land of wine. Many scholars believe that Vinland was located in the region of present-day Newfoundland, Canada. The Vikings did not just explore the area, but built a small settlement. This temporary camp was identified centuries later at Lance aux Meadows, where archaeological excavations revealed longhouses built with wood and turf, typical of Norse architecture. Nails, tools, and remnants of objects characteristic of the Vikings were also found, confirming that they had indeed been in North America. These archaeological findings remain the oldest evidence of European presence on the American continent. The discovery of Vinland is one of the most impressive episodes in Viking history, not only because of the distance traveled, but also because of its audacity. Crossing the North Atlantic without compasses, guided only by the sun, the stars, and their knowledge of ocean currents, required precision and courage. This journey demonstrated that the Norse mastered navigation techniques far superior to those of other medieval peoples. However, the Viking presence in North America was brief. Contact with native peoples, called Skraelings in the sagas, was marked by conflicts. After some clashes, the settlers realized that they could not maintain a permanent settlement without reinforcements, and they decided to return to Greenland. Thus, Vinland did not become a lasting colony, but the experience was recorded in the memory of the sagas and became a symbol of this people's exploratory capacity. Even without continuity, the impact of these voyages was immense. They proved that the boundaries of the known world in the Middle Ages were much broader than previously believed. The Vikings showed that with knowledge and courage, it was possible to cross oceans and reach lands beyond the imagination of Europeans. When Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, the Norse had already been there half a millennium earlier. The story of Leif Erikson and the discovery of Vinland is, therefore, the ultimate expression of the Viking spirit, a people who were never content with borders, who saw the seas not as obstacles, but as an invitation to always go further. This journey crowned the expansion westward and became one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of human exploration. As the Vikings expanded their territories, conquered new lands, and established direct contact with Christian kingdoms in England, France, and Eastern Europe, their ancient religion, centered on gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freya, began to face an ever-growing challenge. The encounter with Christianity did not happen peacefully or immediately. At first, the Norse viewed the Christian faith as a foreign curiosity, associated with the monks from the monasteries they plundered, and with kings who tried to negotiate peace in exchange for gold. Over time, however, this contact turned into a profound cultural clash that would lead to the decline of the old beliefs and the slow Christianization of Scandinavia. During the early centuries of expansion, the Vikings regarded Christianity as something far removed from their own reality. They admired the value of churches and monasteries as rich targets filled with gold, silver, and manuscripts, but they did not see Christian gods as superior to theirs. For Norse warriors, an unarmed and kneeling monk did not represent strength. On the contrary, it seemed weak when compared to their worldview, which was built upon courage and the glory earned in battle. This initial disdain explains the violence of the first attacks on religious institutions. However, with the growth of trade and the establishment of permanent settlements in Christian lands, a slow change began to occur. The Vikings started to live alongside Christian peoples, to form alliances, to marry local women, and to negotiate peace treaties that often involved formal baptisms. Many chieftains realized that in order to maintain good political relations and secure conquered lands, adopting Christianity could be a strategic advantage. Thus, in the 10th century after Christ, the first conversions of Scandinavian leaders began, driven far more by pragmatism than spirituality. As time went on, Christian influence intensified. Kings and missionaries sent from England and from the Holy Roman Empire began to actively preach in Scandinavia. In some regions, particularly Denmark, conversion happened relatively quickly, spearheaded by kings such as Harald Bluetooth, who at the end of the 10th century officially adopted Christianity and ordered the construction of churches and the destruction of pagan temples. In other places, such as Norway and Iceland, the process was more conflictive. There were revolts, destruction of the idols of ancient gods, and battles between pagan and Christian factions until the new faith became dominant. This Christianization did not mean an immediate replacement of old beliefs. For a long time, the two religions coexisted side by side. It was common to find people who attended Christian ceremonies while still making offerings to Norse gods. This mixture, called syncretism, left deep marks on Scandinavian culture, such as symbols and customs that survived through the centuries. The Icelandic sagas, for example, were written centuries later by Christian authors, but still carry the worldview and strength of pagan traditions. The acceptance of Christianity brought deep changes to the social and political structure of the Norse. With the new faith came new legal codes, a network of alliances with powerful European kingdoms, and the strengthening of monarchy, as kings began to be seen not only as warrior leaders, but also as representatives of the church. This new order helped transform the old decentralized clans into unified kingdoms, integrating Scandinavia into the medieval European world. Gradually, wooden temples dedicated to Odin and Thor were replaced by churches, and ancient rituals such as sacrifices gave way to Christian sacraments. However, even with formal conversion, the heritage of Norse beliefs never completely disappeared. It remained alive in stories, traditions, and customs, resisting as part of this people's identity. Christianization marked the beginning of the end of the old Viking religion, but it also opened the doors to a new chapter in Norse history. It was the moment when the men of the North ceased to be only explorers and raiders, and became kings and lords who now played the same political and religious game as the rest of Europe, trading the axe for the scepter and integrating themselves into the medieval Christian world. With the advance of raids, trade, and contact with Christianity, Viking society began to undergo a profound political transformation. What had once been a loose collection of independent clans, united only by temporary alliances, gradually reorganized itself into more complex structures that gave rise to the first Scandinavian kingdoms. Between the 9th and 11th centuries after Christ, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden began to consolidate as more stable political entities, led by kings who sought to control wide territories and unify their people. This transition marked the beginning of the end of the age of great raiders and the rise of monarchies that would come to play central roles in medieval European politics. Denmark was the first to achieve a higher degree of centralization. Benefiting from its strategic geographic position between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, it became an essential passage point for trade routes. Danish chieftains such as Gorm the Old and his son Harald Bluetooth were key figures in this process. Harald, famous for adopting Christianity in the 10th century, unified rival tribes and established a stronger government, building fortifications and encouraging the construction of churches. Under his leadership, Denmark became a recognized kingdom, respected by both allies and enemies. His successors continued to expand this influence, ensuring that the Danes held a prominent place among the Norse peoples. Norway, on the other hand, was a land marked by fjords and mountains that made centralization difficult. For a long time, each region was governed by a powerful local jarl, and unification only began to take shape under the command of Harald Fairhair. According to the sagas, he swore to conquer all of Norway so that he could marry the woman he desired. This personal motivation turned into a military campaign that gave him control over much of Norwegian territory. Despite this achievement, Norway remained fragmented for a long time, and royal authority had to coexist with the power of local chieftains, who still maintained great autonomy. Sweden followed a somewhat different path. During the Viking Age, the region was less focused on Western raids and more on trade with Eastern Europe. Swedish kings established routes across the Baltic Sea and along the rivers that led to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and their influence was consolidated primarily through the wealth obtained from these exchanges. In cities like Birka, the presence of a central power was visible. Although many districts still remained under local control, over time this central power strengthened and laid the foundations of the future Swedish kingdom. The process of forming these kingdoms was slow and full of internal conflicts. Traditional assemblies, such as the Things, did not disappear, but lost part of their influence as royal authority consolidated. Kings had to balance central power with the autonomy of clans, which was a constant challenge. In many cases, alliances were formed through marriages, the distribution of land, and the wealth gained from expeditions. With the advent of Christianity, kings also came to rely on the support of the church, which provided religious legitimacy to monarchical power. This political transition also had direct consequences for the way Vikings interacted with the outside world. Instead of depending exclusively on attacks, these kingdoms began to organize expeditions with more strategic goals and to establish diplomatic treaties. In England, for example, Danish kings came to control vast territories, culminating in the reign of Canute the Great, who in the 11th century ruled an empire that included Denmark, Norway, and England. The formation of these kingdoms marked the beginning of the end of the so-called Viking Age. With stronger states, more centralized laws, and organized armies, the chaotic impulse of raiding gave way to a political power that was more predictable and integrated with the rest of medieval Europe. Scandinavia left behind the centuries when its warriors were merely a threat from the sea and transformed into a group of Christianized kingdoms, respected and feared. This evolution shows that the Vikings were not only destroyers, but also builders. They created institutions, shaped territories, and gave rise to states that would play a fundamental role in Europe's destiny for centuries to come. Throughout the Viking Age, a succession of battles and military campaigns shaped not only the destiny of Scandinavia, but also that of medieval Europe. Combining speed, strategy, and courage, the Vikings confronted kings, organized armies, and entire empires, leaving behind a legacy of conflicts that changed borders, created kingdoms, and ultimately marked the transition of this people from raiders to rulers. Among these battles, some stand out for their historical importance and symbolism: Stamford Bridge, Clontarf, Edington, the Siege of Paris, and the campaigns of the Great Heathen Army. One of the most emblematic battles was Stamford Bridge, fought on September 25th of the year 1066 after Christ. This clash marked the definitive end of the great Viking invasions in England. King Harald Hardrada of Norway landed with a large and powerful army in the north of England, seeking to claim the throne that he believed was rightfully his. After defeating local forces at Fulford, he was surprised by the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson, who marched quickly from the south to confront him. The battle was brutal and prolonged, but ended with Hardrada's defeat and death. Stamford Bridge became a symbol of the end of the era of Norse conquests, because although the Normans, descendants of Vikings, would soon conquer England in the Battle of Hastings, raids coming directly from Scandinavia would lose relevance from that point on. Another famous battle was Clontarf, fought in Ireland in 1014 after Christ. This conflict involved Irish forces led by King Brian Boru against an alliance of Viking chieftains from Dublin and their allies. Although Brian Boru emerged victorious, his death on the battlefield made the event an ambiguous turning point. While the victory weakened Viking power in Ireland, it did not completely eliminate their presence. Even so, Clontarf symbolizes the beginning of the decline of Norse influence on the island, which for centuries had been an important center of commerce and power for the Vikings. In the context of England, the Battle of Edington in 878 after Christ also deserves mention. In this battle, Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, achieved a decisive victory against the great heathen army led by Guthrum. This triumph allowed the Anglo-Saxons to consolidate their territory in the south of England and establish a treaty that recognized the Danelaw in the north and east. This agreement defined for many decades the division of English territory between areas controlled by the Vikings and those controlled by the Saxons, showing how the invaders had evolved from mere raiders to rulers of vast regions. Another notable episode was the siege of Paris in 845 after Christ, led by Ragnar Lothbrok, or by leaders inspired by this legendary figure. A fleet of more than 100 ships sailed up the River Seine to the Frankish capital, spreading panic among its defenders. Unable to stop the invaders, the Franks opted to pay a huge tribute in gold and silver so that the Vikings would withdraw. This event reinforced the fame of these warriors as masters of lightning warfare and highlighted the vulnerability of large medieval cities against the mobility and surprise tactics of the Draka ships. These campaigns were made possible thanks to the formation of the Great Heathen Army, a massive force that arrived in England in 865 after Christ, gathering thousands of warriors. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, such as Ivar the Boneless, Ubba and Halfdan, this force was responsible for the fall of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the imposition of Viking control over much of the island. Unlike the fast raids of the early decades, the Great Heathen Army represented a more organized movement with goals of conquest and colonization. This campaign shifted the balance of power in England and left deep marks on the region's culture and demography. Outside the British Isles, the Vikings also carried out significant campaigns on the European continent. They sailed up rivers such as the Loire, Garonne, and Seine, attacking cities like Rouen, Nantes, and Tours. They also reached the Iberian Peninsula, where they attacked Muslim territories, and advanced into Italy, even sacking cities in Sicily. These attacks demonstrated that no coastal or riverine area was beyond the reach of Norse sails. All of these battles and campaigns were not only acts of violence, they also revealed the Vikings' capacity for adaptation. Over time, these incursions ceased to be purely destructive and instead became a gateway to the establishment of permanent colonies, political agreements, and cultural integration. However, for the peoples who lived under the shadow of these expeditions, the names Stamford Bridge, Clontarf, and Paris remained etched as memories of terror and resistance. The period of greatest splendor of the Viking Age, between the 9th and 11th centuries after Christ, was marked by an impressive combination of maritime power, economic prosperity, and political influence across almost the entire European continent and even beyond its borders. It was at this peak that the Norse ceased to be mere raiders and became active protagonists in the shaping of kingdoms, trade routes, and political systems. Viking presence could be felt from the North Atlantic to the Black Sea, from the Mediterranean to the vast steppes of Asia. Their reputation as sailors and warriors grew so strong that kings and emperors, once terrified by their triangular sails, began to seek alliances and even hire them as elite forces. The main engine of this peak was their mastery of navigation. The drakars and nars, long and flexible ships, gave the Vikings an unparalleled strategic advantage. With these vessels, they could reach any coast swiftly, sail up narrow rivers, and retreat before an organized response could be mounted. This control of the seas allowed them to create true networks of trade and influence that transformed the political and economic map of the period. Contrary to the limited image of pillaging, most of the Viking wealth during this golden age came from trade. Goods such as furs, amber, honey, enslaved people, and weapons were exchanged for silver, silk, wine, spices, and luxury objects brought from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Politically, Viking presence began to shape Europe. In many regions, they ceased to be external forces and became rulers. Normandy in present-day France was born out of this process, with leaders like Rollo taking control of lands in exchange for protecting the region from future attacks. In England, the creation of the Danelaw transformed cities like Jorvik into Norse urban centers. At certain times, Scandinavian kings ruled over key parts of the British Isles, as in the case of Canute the Great, who united under his crown England, Denmark, and Norway in a northern empire. In Eastern Europe, the founding of Kiev by the Varangians gave rise to a new political center that would become decisive in Russian history. This period was also characterized by an intense flow of silver and gold into Scandinavia. The tributes paid by cities and kingdoms to avoid attacks, known as Danegeld, filled the coffers of many chiefs and kings. This wealth was reinvested in more ships, better weapons, and alliances that expanded Viking power. The trade of enslaved people was another central factor in this wealth, as the Norse supplied markets from Muslim Spain to Constantinople. This increasing wealth gave rise to larger towns, more elaborate fortresses, and an increasingly powerful warrior aristocracy. The peak also manifested itself militarily. Beyond raiding, the Vikings began offering their services as mercenaries, becoming elite combatants for the wealthiest kings and emperors. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople is a prime example. Composed of Scandinavian warriors, it was considered one of the most loyal and ferocious troops in the Byzantine world. Their role as protectors of the emperor was so remarkable that they became a lasting part of the empire's identity. Culturally, this was a fertile period. The circulation of people, goods, and ideas opened Scandinavia to foreign influences. Craftsmanship, building techniques, legal systems, and even fashion began to be shaped by this constant contact. Markets such as Hedeby and Birka became cosmopolitan hubs where Arab, Byzantine, Saxon, and Slavic merchants lived and traded alongside Scandinavians. This golden age, however, did not mean the absence of conflict. On the contrary, it was born from the balance between plunder and trade, war and diplomacy. Viking influence grew because the leaders of this period knew how to seize every opportunity, whether by conquering land through force or by turning enemies into allies. Their power lay not only in the sword, but in their ability to navigate between two worlds, the wild and the civilized, the raider and the merchant. By the 11th century, the Vikings were respected and feared throughout Europe, and it was precisely at this peak that the factors that would lead to their decline began to appear. The strengthening of local defenses, conversion to Christianity, the rise of stable Scandinavian kingdoms, and the gradual integration of these people into the political structures of the continent. Yet while it lasted, the Viking Golden Age left such a profound impact that the name of these northern sailors became synonymous with power and audacity for centuries to come. The end of the Viking Age did not happen overnight. It was a slow, multifactorial process that unfolded over the 11th and 12th centuries after Christ. After nearly 300 years of expansion, conquests, and mastery of the seas, the very factors that had fueled the rise of the Vikings began to change, gradually reducing their ability to carry out the raids that had once spread terror across Europe. Among the causes of this decline were internal changes in Scandinavia, the increasingly organized resistance of the peoples they targeted, and the cultural and religious transformations brought about by Christianity. One of the main internal reasons for the end of the Great Raids was the consolidation of the Scandinavian kingdoms. As Denmark, Norway, and Sweden transformed into stable monarchies, the internal disputes that had once driven many young men to seek wealth and fame abroad diminished. With stronger kings, expeditions became more controlled and focused on clear political goals, leaving less room for independent attacks led by local chieftains. What had once been a society of decentralized clans, driven by personal glory, evolved into a group of kingdoms that now had to defend borders, collect taxes, and maintain peace with their Christian neighbors. Another decisive factor was the Christianization of Scandinavia. Throughout the 10th and early 11th centuries, Christianity spread across the region, gradually replacing the old pagan beliefs. This change affected not only spirituality, but also the collective mentality. Scandinavia's integration into Christendom also meant integration into the broader political and diplomatic system of Europe, where violent raids against other Christian kingdoms came to be viewed as internal aggressions within the same faith. With this cultural transformation, many former Viking chieftains became knights and allies of the very kings they had once fought. External defenses also changed. After nearly 2 centuries of constant attacks, the coastal regions of England, France, and Ireland adapted. Monasteries and villages that had once been defenseless became fortified. Watchtowers were built along coasts and rivers, and local armies became faster and better trained to respond to invasions. Moreover, major battles such as Edington in 878 and later Stamford Bridge in 1066 showed that local peoples had gained the capacity to confront the Norse on equal terms. From an economic standpoint, opportunities that had once been found in plunder were replaced by trade. The towns and trade routes established by the Vikings themselves came to offer more profit through peaceful commerce than through war. As these markets grew and local wealth increased, looting ceased to be a vital means of survival. Many warriors therefore preferred to settle down as merchants or hired guards, rather than risk everything in uncertain expeditions. The very nature of the voyages also changed. In the early Viking Age, raids were quick, carried out by small groups seeking wealth. Over time, they began to require larger fleets, facing stronger armies and better prepared defenses. This increase in risk reduced rewards and increased losses. The world had learned to deal with the Vikings, and what had once been an element of surprise became something expected. A symbolic event often seen as the final point of the Viking Age was the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 in England. In that battle, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada attempted to seize the English crown, but was defeated and killed. This defeat marked the last great attempt at a direct invasion from Scandinavia. Just 3 weeks later, England would be conquered by the Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France a century earlier, showing that the Norse spirit continued, but in a new form. After this period, the descendants of the Vikings continued to play an important role in European history, but now integrated into the continent's political and cultural systems. They had ceased to be the invaders from the north and had become kings, merchants, and knights of a changing Christian world. Thus, the decline of the Viking Age was the result of a series of deep transformations. When the conditions that had given rise to the raids, political instability, the need for new lands, and the weakness of neighboring kingdoms no longer existed, this people adapted to a new time. If at the beginning their strength lay in surprise and mobility, in the end their legacy was found in what they had built: cities, trade routes, naval techniques, and a cultural heritage that transformed the history of Europe. The legacy of the Vikings goes far beyond the trail of fire and steel that their raids left during the Middle Ages. Between the 8th and 11th centuries after Christ, these sailors and warriors not only plundered and conquered, but also planted lasting seeds that profoundly shaped the culture, politics, economy, and even the genetics of Europe. The image of the savage barbarian who only destroys is far removed from historical reality. They were also builders of cities, organizers of trade routes, founders of states, and transmitters of ideas and technologies that transformed entire societies. One of the most visible legacies is found in the human geography of Europe. In regions such as Normandy, northern England, Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Russia, the Viking presence left marks in language, place names, and the genetic composition of local populations. Cities such as Dublin, founded by the Norse, became urban centers that remain important to this day. In England, words of Norse origin such as sky, window, and egg became part of everyday vocabulary, a reflection of the period when the Danelaw was under Scandinavian control. Town names ending in by, thorp, and kirk are direct testimonies of Norse occupation. From a political perspective, the Vikings introduced concepts that influenced the social and legal structures of various regions. The assemblies known as Thing, where free men gathered to make decisions, judge disputes, and establish laws, inspired participatory forms of government. Iceland, colonized by them, created the Althing, considered the oldest parliament still in operation in the world. This tradition of self-government left an imprint on the way certain medieval communities organized their justice systems and collective decision-making. In terms of commerce and economy, the Vikings were the great connectors of the Middle Ages. Their roots linked Scandinavia to the British Isles, continental Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and even the Abbasid Caliphate. This flow brought products, coins, techniques, and ideas from distant regions to lands that, before the Viking Age, were much more isolated. In doing so, they opened pathways for the formation of a broader, interconnected medieval economy. Markets such as Hedeby and Birka became cosmopolitan hubs, and cities such as Jorvik, grew in commercial importance under Norse influence. The cultural impact was also profound. Viking art, with its intricate carvings, interwoven patterns and animal motifs, inspired later medieval styles. The oral literature of the Norse, transformed into sagas in Christianized Iceland, preserved a unique heritage of mythological and epic stories that centuries later still fascinate readers and scholars. These sagas were much more than entertainment. They are historical and cultural records of a mindset that valued honor, courage, and destiny. Another striking aspect of the Viking legacy is the genetic and cultural integration resulting from intermarriage and prolonged coexistence with local populations. In regions such as England, Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Russia, the fusion between Norse and native peoples created new identities and hybrid communities. This phenomenon was especially notable in Normandy, where the descendants of Vikings became Normans and later played a continental role, such as in the conquest of England in 1066. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation are also an essential part of this legacy. The technology of Viking ships, capable of sailing both in open seas and in shallow rivers, revolutionized mobility at the time. This knowledge spread across Europe and opened the way for other maritime explorations. It can be said that the Vikings pioneered the concept of oceanic expansion centuries before the Great Age of exploration. Finally, there is the symbolic legacy. The courage, boldness, and determination that defined the Vikings left behind a powerful imaginary. Even after the end of the Viking Age, kings and nobles of Europe continued to fear and respect those who descended from these northern sailors. To this day, the word Viking evokes images of freedom, adventure, and resilience. Thus, although the Viking Age officially ended with the consolidation of the Scandinavian kingdoms and the Christianization of the region, the impact of this people never disappeared. They redrew borders, created new cities, introduced systems of law, opened trade routes, and left a permanent mark on European culture. The Viking legacy is, therefore, a combination of war and construction, destruction and innovation, showing that this people shaped medieval history in a way that no other civilization of their time managed to match. The Vikings entered the memory of the world as wild warriors who emerged from the fog with dragon-shaped ships, raiding cities and spreading terror. But history, when analyzed in depth, reveals a much broader and more complex picture. These men and women of the North were, at the same time, daring navigators, visionary merchants, colonizers, artists, legislators, and agents of transformation. For approximately 300 years, from the end of the 8th century to the middle of the 11th century after Christ, they changed the political, cultural, and economic map of Europe and opened routes that connected the medieval world in an unprecedented way. Behind the image of relentless attacks was a structured and adaptable society. The same people who plundered monasteries in England founded Dublin and York. The same warriors who defeated Saxon kings created legal systems such as the Althing, a democratic assembly that survived for centuries. The same navigators who crossed seas in search of glory reached the North Atlantic and set foot in America long before any other European. War was only part of their identity. Equally important were their ability to build, negotiate, and integrate into new cultures. The legacy they left behind transcends borders and centuries. They helped form kingdoms such as Normandy, influenced the politics of England, Ireland, and Scotland, created the foundations of the state of Kiev in Eastern Europe, served as guardians of emperors in Byzantium, and even traded goods with the Islamic world. The cities they built, the trade routes they opened, and the navigation techniques they perfected shaped medieval Europe and laid the foundations for the age of great explorations. The decline of the Viking Age did not erase their mark. On the contrary, as they were absorbed by other cultures, the Norse carried with them their traditions, their genetics, and their worldview. The fusion between these roots and new influences created hybrid peoples who continued to play central roles in European history, such as the Normans, who conquered England in 1066, or the Rus of Kiev, who became one of the cultural and political pillars of Eastern Europe. The myth of the Vikings, therefore, was born from the impact they caused when they appeared as almost unstoppable forces in a medieval world accustomed to static borders. But history shows that they were much more than invaders. They were explorers who did not accept the limits of the known world, visionaries who connected peoples and builders who left permanent marks. The roar of the winds that pushed their dracars still echoes today as a symbol of courage and transformation. The Viking Age ended nearly 1,000 years ago, but the fascination it inspires remains alive. It is a story of adaptation, boldness, and how a people from the extreme cold transformed themselves and others in every land they touched. They were not just warriors, they were creators of paths, and the paths they opened continue to this day to shape the course of human history.